Hello and welcome to the live stream. Hopefully I'm coming through okay, and if anyone's going to be joining us live, I'm excited to have you here. But thank you so much for being here, and if you're watching like in post, also welcome to the channel. Welcome to the Wrap Party specifically. So, in case this is something that's new to you, or just want a quick refresher, Wrap Party is something I do personally on the channel. Basically, it's kind of a capstone to when I finish a game, especially because, you know, these games are so narratively dense. I like to be able to just kind of have a no holds back, spoiler full experience type of a relation. Be like, hey, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to say about the game in general. Very, very happy to see how things are going to be going and can kind of give my take on it as a whole. You've obviously heard my opinion running through the entire series, but now I kind of want to cultivate the entire experience as a whole. And this is probably going to be a bit of a shorter one because whilst this game has like depth of an ocean, it also has a very small cast. So while I'm going to be able to talk about things, like ultimately I'm only talking about like 6 different characters. Like if we really think about it, so that's going to be what's really fun to see. I also get to interact with some people who are here live, so say hello to people occasionally, be able to answer some questions directly, and I'll try and kind of like physically respond to what's in the chat, just because I know not everybody's going to be watching and reading the chat along. I've watched enough live streams to know that that's usually how it goes. So Theo of Hearts, welcome. You say hello. Didn't see the novel, but that OP was a banger. Oh yeah, absolutely. So this is not going to be a great place if you like maybe listen to it initially, but don't stick around if this sounds like it might be your cup of tea, because this novel is fantastic. It's another one of those examples of a diamond in the rough, I would say. This was another find that was kind of directed / gifted to me by Fruitbat Factory, who are a kind of a wonderful localizing team who snatch up these real gems that are being developed that might not normally see a bunch of mainstream, and they've absolutely handed me some of my favorite games I've played. If you've ever heard of the visual novel Seabed, which I will never stop ranting about, still one of my top games of all time. Yeah, we're like, it's another one of those types, and this game's definitely one of those up there. It's a lot darker, which I don't have a problem with, but others might. I don't know if like a lot of people who play visual novels or get really drawn to the rom-com, you know, romance and kind of like a chill atmosphere. This is definitely on the more intense side of the scale. So if you like things like Fata Morgana, if you like things like, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of an example. I guess Sound of Drop Fall into Poison. There's it's definitely on the darker side, but it's all in a bad way, and it's not in cliche ways either. It really tackles some really unique narratives and unique characters, so absolutely worth getting into. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, and the things I start saying about the game catch your interest, like make sure you leave and go read the novel, because I don't want to spoil everything for you. But you know, that's also kind of like the whole point of this of a wrap party, is it's kind of the chance for me to really just kind of unleash my thoughts on stuff. But as you said before, like when you came in, that the OP is a banger. This entire game has some incredible music. The music scores in the background, which of course you'll be hearing throughout this entire review, majority of them are just really solid to listen to. Sometimes they actually have hidden messages in them, where the songs and the lyrics are tied directly to the types of scenes that you're watching, and you'll have an entire track that is dedicated to one like specific ending in a specific path for a specific character. You might only hear it once or twice in the entire game, which, by the way, this game feels like more like 3 games. It has 3 acts. The first and second act were released, and then the third act was released later, but the third act by itself was about as long as the other 2 acts, so it really feels like 2 different games. But the soundtrack is absolutely probably one of the best parts of the game. Clearly a lot of love went into it. A downside of how much love went into it is that my entire playthrough has basically been claimed, like that, which isn't a problem, but it means that these videos are monetized, but I don't get any of the monetization. Again, it's fine. It pretty much just goes straight back to the artists, and that's okay. They kind of have that right to do so. I knew it was very likely going in, I believe. I was told a long time ago, but when they gave me a copy of the game, they said pretty much that very likely would happen unless I wanted to like mute the tracks, which nah, not really. I really don't mind because I'm not doing this to try and like, I'm not making a living off of it. It's a passion project. I just don't want my videos getting taken down. So that was my only like compunction is like, hey, if the videos can still be posted, if they can be viewed and it's not restricted, then I'm okay with it. And so that's just, but it's just food for thought that like the quality of the soundtrack is phenomenal. All right. So we're gonna start diving into it because we really want to. I want to kind of break this down. I've got to give it a bit of an intro to it, and I guess it's hard because I want to classify it, and it's hard. Mamiya does not stick to a lot of the standard tropes, taboos, or even categories. I guess the closest I would call it would be psychological horror, but it's not really psychological horror because that implies that there are people who are being like attacked psychologically, and it's not. It's more about broken people dealing with psychological issues, mostly in unhealthy ways, but working toward like finding out ways to process that trauma and the fear and the guilt that they've gone through in life. Because it's so funny that there's also I would also almost classify this as an eldritch horror type of story, but it also doesn't really encapsulate it because when you think of eldritch horror, you're thinking like Cthulhu, powers beyond like understanding, and the reason why it kind of feels like that is that there's a lot to the game that's left as an enigma. There are rules that we never quite get fully explained to us. There are high concept like features to the narrative that never get properly defined. Another way it reminds me of magic in the Lord of the Rings series, which is something that I personally can kind of gripe with. I love fantasy settings and I love fantasy books, but Lord of the Rings has magic that just seems like it kind of just exists. But the nice thing is that what makes Lord of the Rings work, where others like that don't, is that the magic in Lord of the Rings it has a set rules and structure. There's limits to what it can do and what it can't do. And just because it's not explained to us as the reader doesn't mean that there isn't a level of consistency throughout it. And it works because there's consistency even if we don't understand it. And that's similar to what happens in Mamiya. There are rules in place that we don't really get to see and we don't really get a proper understanding of, but because the rules stay consistent through the story, as you discover more of what's possible, it doesn't feel like it's cheating. That the narrative is like pulling these like Deus Ex Machina type events out of its hat and just kind of deciding that things are going to be a certain way because they are. So the narrative is really interesting in that way, where I, even at the end of this game, do not truly understand everything that was going on. I don't know if I could because of the way that the story is told, but I understood enough. So Thieves of Hearts, you continue. You said, so it's more of a literary story rather than being a concrete piece of genre fiction. Yeah, it's definitely more of a play. It almost plays with genre fiction. It takes concepts from these and it kind of uses them as a foil to kind of play against. It's very interesting. Like, again, there's not really another story I've come across like Mamiya out there. There's definitely themes that you've seen in other stories and genres, but like the way that they execute it is so different and so personalized and unique that I've actually said that like there's a lot of visual novels that I play that I enjoy, and I've seen some that get an adaptation like into an anime, or they breach like the medium, and there's a lot of stories that I think are given a disservice by that. My experience with things like, I'm glad you're excited. You definitely should check this one out. If you haven't seen this one and you really like if you want to try something like really like different, I really fundamentally think this is a good one to grab. But as I was saying, the idea of that it sits outside of this area, the playgrounds, you could say, where the same kind of tropes are walked, and you basically, majority of stories when they break out of their medium, often it can be a disservice. I'm talking about when you take a film when you take a book and you convert it to a film or an anime from a light novel or a manga, there's often something that's lost in that process. Sometimes it works. There's plenty of stories that go from like the manga or the visual novel to the anime, and it works really well. I would say Steins Gate's one of the better examples where the anime worked, despite the fact that it lost a lot from the visual novel, and the visual novel is far superior. People who didn't read the visual novel enjoyed the anime. People who read the visual novel enjoyed the anime. It just worked. And then you have other examples where it just really didn't. I'd say Rewrite is a good example of an anime that did not really capture the magic of its source material at all. I'd also argue that the Muv-Luv anime have really struggled. The best Muv-Luv I've seen animated was Total Eclipse, and even then, the visual novel just left it in the dust, and there's really no comparison there. This is one of those stories, Mamiya is one of those that I think could actually do a decent anime adaptation into a anime or even a live action, because the way the narration works and the way the story is communicated. It's also just so artistic. There's so much that the visuals lean on that is really interesting, where the narration that you read doesn't burden itself by constantly trying to set the scene. It lets the art speak for itself, which I think it speaks volumes about the confidence that the creators had. I think a lot of times you'll read a visual novel and like it's not a problem per se, but you can kind of tell that the script was written before the art was created, that the art was made after the fact, that it just showcased and was meant to reflect what was being described in the text, which is fine. I think it works really well that way. It gives you extra flair. This game feels like it was almost the other way around, or at least it was in tandem, where they maybe storyboarded and world like kind of came up with all the art and these like these panels that depicted critical events, and then they wrote the story around that structure, because the visuals just play such a heavy role, which you'll probably see if you're paying attention, obviously, to some of the screenshots I captured throughout the game. There's just so much, and they're so visceral, and they're so powerful. They're well done, and you have these moments where it almost feels like instead of reading a visual novel, it's almost like you're walking through an art gallery. So yeah, another way you can think about this too is that this is an art piece. This game steps outside of the normal rules because it's trying to share something that's beyond just like a narration or a story. Very good. It's very well done. And I'm going to dive into some of the details with the characters, but I feel like I've been able to more or less adequately express why this game was so good, in just the fact that it has feel, it has punch, and it has like a spark that you just don't see very often. And that's very, very powerful for me. I was very excited to stumble upon it. I was grateful that it was recommended / gifted. Again, Fruitbat Factory, they've kind of done a good job. One of the things that's nice about them is that because they're a smaller company, like you can almost sometimes feel like there's some localizers that just kind of are grabbing whatever they can get licensed to and hoping one of it sticks. I feel like Fruitbat Factory has had a good job of cultivating the selections that they have. They're not like specified to a specific genre. They've been able to share some things that I definitely know wouldn't appeal to everybody, but what they grab usually is really solid. And I like how they also grab something that they get passionate themselves about, because when they've shared the games with me, it's not just like, oh, here's a random code for you. It's like, no, based on what you've played on your channel, I think this would be a good one for you. And whenever they've taken that time to be personally invested, where they've said like, hey, I think you should try this game out, it's actually been a banger, and it's been something that does vibe with me in a very personal way. Some of them are stronger than others, but that's just the nature of stories. But again, I'm just saying, like, as a company, like, they're not paying me. Like, the closest to paying is the fact that they've given me like keys to some of their games. But kudos for them, because they've been a great supporter of a channel, and the fact that they took a gamble with a channel like mine, like a size of the channel, like, I'm not likely to give them a return on investment. So I'm just glad that they saw my passion and enjoyment of the games I played and felt like I would be a decent platform to showcase some of these titles that might not normally get attention. So I'm really grateful to them for that. Gizia, you say it's interesting you're getting that feeling because if I recall, the author shared their fan box. They sometimes did have some of the CGs and wrote around them. Also, hi, good to see you. So that's kind of cool that like if that's the case, if like you're right about that, which I fully believe, but recollection and actual quotes, you never know, but. If you're right about that, that means that's something I got a feel for just from the experience of reading. And that speaks volumes. I don't read dev diaries. I don't look at a lot of these discussion boards because I don't want to see spoilers. Like now I'm at the point where I would, and I might dig in a little bit and learn more, but you're getting my just very raw personal experience with the game and my interpretation. So if they actually said that and I was able to pick up on that, I think that does showcase just how executed that vision was. Thieves, you say again, I'll definitely keep it in mind. Guess I should probably step out before you spoil things, but I hope you have a good night. See you later. Thank you, Thieves. I hope you see you. And I don't know if you've stepped out already, but thank you so much for being here. And yes, don't stick around for the spoilers. Grab yourself a copy. Come back. This will be archived in the playlist, so you'll definitely be able to listen to it. But thank you for stopping by and saying hello. Now, let's start getting into the meat and potatoes. Again, like, it's funny because I've had these wrap parties, and I've had them go for like 2-3 hours. I don't see that happening here. But then again, I don't know. Maybe I'll be surprised. So, as a quick reminder, the way that this game breaks down is you're basically watching like stories play out in parallel with each other. Which is interesting because sometimes they coincide in a way that couldn't actually work, and then other times they seem to overlap in ways that do, especially at the end, where you get this kind of main canon that's happening, but the canon that gets established is something that's felt out. And it's funny because it's so intentional, it's not even like a joke. So when you first start the game, you basically are thrown right into a story with Suo and Rio, and you'll find that the characters often are tied together in pairs, and that the pairing offs don't always make a lot of sense. Like, there's not like, oh, well, these two are clearly tied together. It's more of that their themes are tied together. For Suo and Rio, who are the first two characters you really get introduced to, they are literally bound together. Suo as a character is really interesting. He's depicted as the childlike character, but he's also like really tall. He's depicted as being a dreamer. And I have to say that of the characters, he still to this day is probably my least favorite, but he really grew on me between Acts 1 and Act 3. During Act 1, I found him to be almost frustratingly naive. I found him to be kind of creepy, and not just like in the sense that where he like had a breakdown and really took a dive off the deep end. Before that, even when he was kind of in his more balanced state, I just found his personality to kind of be a bit jarring. It would be an individual who, like, I've met people like him before, where they are the kind of people who will like walk up to you and they'll just talk to you, and they'll talk to you for so long about really random stuff, and they're not good at reading the room. So if you feel like if you're trying to like, leave, you need to move on, need to do stuff. Ever had that person who will talk to you, and you're like, all right, I kind of like, I need to go, like, I need to meet up with somebody, or I have to go talk to somebody else, or I'm just like kind of done with this conversation, I need to move forward. And you try and like kind of give like those socially acceptable exits, but then they won't let you go. They'll just keep talking to you. And so like it gets to a point where you feel like you have to basically just be rude and just tell them like, hey, I need to leave. Because they just won't pick up on the little signals. That's basically who Suo is as a character. He's very like caring and a dreamer, but he gets this kind of dark streak with him where he becomes attached. And he's also very disconnected from the world, where he focuses so much on his dreams and his fictions and fantasies. He's just disappointed in real life. And I feel like that's something we could probably all relate to, honestly. How many of us have had moments where we just like are enjoying a good story, reading a visual novel, watching an anime, like listening to an audiobook, whatever it is that you do for fun. And you're like, man, even in the chaos and struggle that I see in this book, it's like, or in this story, it's like, you get that feeling of like, why is my life like such a chore, but also so boring? That's basically Suo's whole fantasy, even though he's young, like he's still in school, but he's just struggling where he feels like there's no fulfillment in real life. He just dreams and finds that the places that he gets to explore in his dreams, both in daydreams and in actual dreams, fill him with a lot more give him more fulfillment. So then you get that breakdown where you see how in his mind he believes so strongly in his visions of dreams and his desire that it starts intruding on his real life. So he starts sleepwalking. He has issues where he's going into the cold and dangerous situations. And he also like finds that a person who doesn't remember their name, who just randomly wanders into his life. He falls kind of in love with having somebody who depends on him, who's at his home, and it makes his life interesting. The mystery surrounding like who he is because he has amnesia, and that becomes like his focus. It becomes his obsession because suddenly his life has meaning and spice to it. And that devolves into a situation where instead of trying to help this person who's like lost their memory, he basically traps them in the basement. And it's like, well, that was terrifying. And then you kind of divide, like you go from a platform of basically kidnapping a helpless person and storing them in your house and like trapping them there, like Misery style. And you're like, how do you not have a negative opinion of that kind of a character? Like, it's just so creepy. But then you go to explore and you learn more about him, and you see things like how he has an illusion that's a voice that he hears, that he's heard ever since he was a child. And that's a detail that was revealed really early in the story, but you don't realize how significant it is, probably because it's your first introduction. But then when it comes back around at the end of the game, you find out that was one of the most critical clues that would be impactful to the story for the whole thing. It kind of is almost the linchpin of the entire story. Suo is the origin of Mamiya as the illusion, which is, again, that's the whole idea, that this is about a shared illusion. So it's about people who are definitely not mentally well, who are having hallucinations, talking to those hallucinations, listening to the hallucinations, and making decisions based on that interaction. But the hallucination, the reason why it's Eldritch Horror, is because there's actually a real entity behind the illusions. So the illusions might be in their minds, but they're actual creatures you could think of. And so that's what the horror is, because it's like these are creatures that are playing off of the vulnerabilities of the minds in which they kind of inhabit. And they pull the strings and kind of fester. So they took the worst parts of Suo, his desire for life to be more interesting, and his imagination, and it twists that into trying to grab and hold on to anything that makes his life feel like it has more meaning and control it. And that's where that illusion takes somebody who is a very normal human with normal human problems, but then twists them into an extreme by simply being there to kind of give that little push. And you can see like it's one of those things where that twisting, while it feels kind of like terrifying, doesn't feel unreal. It feels like something that people could and have done. And that's part of the horror, is that it's really believable that somebody would hear a voice in their head and slowly be pushed to doing something that they normally might not have done. It's incredible. And then you have this exploration later on, because when the timelines get fused, which is, we'll talk about that later, because I'll talk about Natsumi towards the end. But again, that's the problem with this Wrap Party 2, is like it's gonna be something that if you try to listen to halfway, or if you've never played the game, I'm gonna sound like a mad person, because it doesn't make any sense, and it's very hard to just like I can try and simplify this, but the more I'll simplify it, but it'll always leave like a hole where it's like, well, wait, what do you mean by this? And then it'll expand, and then like there'll be something in there, and you'll be like, what do you mean by this? And it'll just turn into this gigantic tree of just trying to express an idea and concept in a simple way. It just will be impossible, truly impossible to do in a good job. I think the best summary for this game was in the beginning, and I didn't say anything actual meaningful about the game. I just told you some generalizations of how it feels to read the game, and that's the best way you can summarize these things, in my opinion. So forgive me for the ranting and rambling that is about to ensue. So when the timelines are fused, and we learn more about Suo, we learn about how he as an entity, as a person, isn't actually a person. He's kind of an entity as well, because he's trapped in a weird loop that's almost like, okay. All right, here's where we're gonna get really funky here. Time is not linear in this story, and that's because it's not linear. Real life time is also not linear, but we experience it in a linear way because we have no other option. We go from day to day, and that's just the way things go. Like, time marches forward at a consistent pace. It doesn't have to, though. The laws of physics says no, and in this world, there's a force that is able to enact itself on the world of the story that takes two timelines that have a connection to each other and stitches them together. So technically, events are happening simultaneously at two different times. And because that stitching of time happened, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're introduced to the effects of that decision two entire acts before it happens in the story, which is really, really odd to explain. But just, I guess a good example of this is the idea of a kind of paradox with a time machine. Because say I'm living my life and I'm married, but then somebody breaks into my home and shoots and kills my wife. I then, out of a desperate desire for revenge and to try and save my love, I then build a time machine. It takes about 10 years, but I do it. I then use the time machine to go back in time to the day before my wife is killed. I wait in ambush outside of our home and stop the killer outside, and I eliminate them myself before they can stop and kill my wife. I now introduce a paradox, because now events that were triggered by my decision to build a time machine, my motivation to build the time machine was predicated on the fact that my wife had died. So if I then use that time machine to stop my wife from dying, I have no need or desire in that former point in time to make a time machine. Thus, I would be creating a paradox where that time machine shouldn't exist anymore. So what happens? Well, one of the things you can do that would account for that in the timeline. So if you read games like Steins Gate, they tackle the problem by saying, well, then the world line shifts. When there's a change in time, the universe kind of warps itself to fit that narrative from that point on, and everything else kind of gets edited. So memories and actions and everything else basically reflects what happens in that when that time was shifted. There's also other ideas, which is probably the most realistic one, which would be that the instant you used that time machine, you weren't actually jumping backward in time. You just jumped to a parallel dimension that was almost identical in every single way, except that you exist with a time machine in it in two different places, and you then change events. So you didn't actually change anything. You just simply vanished from your original timeline in which a time machine didn't exist, appeared in a branching timeline in which your time machine could exist, and then did your actions. And from that point on, that time machine wouldn't be a paradox anymore, because it is intrinsically a part of that timeline from the time it should have been existing. So from the perspective of anyone in that universe, that time machine had already existed. Because it would exist and it could travel, the instant that became like a defined fact, that time machine exists for the rest of time, and so is the fluid dynamics of that timeline, because it can account for that. So, why am I going with this? In this storyline, there's a powerful force that eventually takes two different times, the year 1999 and the year 2000, and fuses them together. So the two times are happening in parallel. And you have duplicates of people who are living at the same time. And that allows for interactions to occur that would never normally happen. Because it was out of a desire for Natsumi to save everybody. He fuses the timelines together and in hopes that he can then save people's lives. And inadvertently, because that eventually happens, Suo gets caught up in that paradox. Because Suo dies in 2003. Now, it tries to explain it in the game, but I'm going to try and re-summarize it just to kind of contextualize it. That Suo, as a character, we see living in 2012 in his youth, in a daydreaming youth where he almost like feels like he's not really a part of the world. We also know that he dies in 2003 as a young man, as a young adult, like in his like late teens, early 20s. And that the youth that we see is the youth who lived in 1999, who has inadvertently been pulled into 2012 and doesn't realize what that means, and doesn't, like, that fact never sinks in for him. So he just continues to live his life as he expects, even though everything around him is completely different. When he meets Ryo, he feels drawn to Ryo, who is the amnesiac kid, and is obsessed with him and wants to protect him. And this is an echo of the interaction he has with Ryo in 2003 when he dies. And so he's in this weird paradox where he's like a time traveling entity where he has been set on a path, but then he's also been yanked away from that path. And so he exists as a really enigmatic character where his whole existence should be impossible. But it's not, because of the action that happened in the future. We also then learn part of the whole reason why he even gets caught up in that, you got to remember, is that Suo was also the origin for the original illusion. He had an imaginary friend named Mamiya. And that imaginary friend became two imaginary friends. And then one of these imaginary friends, when they saw that Suo, when he was young, was about to die because he sleptwalked into the ocean and was about to drown because he didn't know how to swim, he breaks through reality, manifesting himself as a physical body, saving Suo, but killing himself in the same time. Because as an imaginary friend, he was actually kind of he was what's called an idea. Mamiya was this imaginary friend, which meant that he was a concept that was kind of birthed into existence by the strong imagination of Suo. And when that happened, he became somewhat tangible. But he broke the rules, essentially, by manifesting himself physically. And it ended up killing what he was as an entity. He was not able... normally, ideas eventually are born as people. It's almost like, you think of a spirit. A spirit is like the soul of a departed person. So like it's like a remaining soul after their physical body has died. An idea is a prenatal soul, like a soul before a body exists, a concept. That concept has a self-actualization. And that's what imaginary friends in this world can be. So Mamiya was that. And Mamiya manifested himself a temporary body, and in so doing, locked himself out of any potential future birth and existence, and kind of died. But he was such a powerful manifestation at that point that he kind of exists as a half ghost, a being that has like its own identity, but can never take any actual form from it. And that's where the story of Mamiya really begins. So we'll kind of talk more about Mamiya down the line. But Suo, you have to always remember, as the origin of the Mamiya illusion, is very fascinating. So what's my opinion of Suo as a character? I think he's probably the most important character. I still don't like his personality very much. And reading his stories, I felt a lot less engaged. But I have to admit that his execution... and the idea that it would take a child and an adult with such a powerful imagination that they might be able to literally like create almost like a spectre based on like the power of that imagination is very fascinating. And it almost reminds me of the idea of like quantum observation, the idea that like by observing particles and making measurements of them, we alter the way that they exist in space and time. Essentially, that our thoughts can shape reality because we're a conscious observer, and somehow that seems like it might actually influence like the way the world works, the way the universe works. Very, very, very cool. And so it's kind of a manifestation of that idea if you took it to an extreme. So while I didn't like his character personality, his role in the story is definitely one of the ones that really occupies my mind the most. I think he's a top tier character for that. And I really enjoyed seeing his story play out. And I also really, really liked, my favorite part was that when we see him getting older, either the version of him that died trying to save a child, or the alternate version where he was able to survive that encounter and became a full-fledged adult, and how he actually became responsible and yet maintained his dreamer like not status, but his dreamer spirit. He found a balance and made it work, and that was beautiful. So top tier character. Not my favorite to read, but definitely a well-made character. And definitely, I think, if there is a linchpin character, not the main character, but linchpin character, it's Suo. His story is so integral to the nature of what we see and do and what happens, being both the beginning and essentially the end of Mamiya. I feel like it's pretty clear that the story, when originally was being written, was probably one of the first characters that was conceptualized. And I think that that's really interesting. Now, his counterpart is Ryo. He's kind of the one that does the dance with Suo. They're tied together, and their characters play off each other really well. The Ryo is traumatized because he's like, he comes from a home of constant survival. Dad no longer in the picture. Mom was abusive. He wants to protect his little sister. And he also has this like inherent seek of violence in his heart, right? I found him to be very compelling as a character. I couldn't imagine living in a world or a state where violence makes the most sense in a given situation, and that there's a pleasure in the process of being violent, but there's something really compelling about exploring his story and why he does what he does. I feel like while his story is probably a lot more on the simple side, being able to see a point of view that felt so real and visceral, and yet one that was so alien to my experience, because I'm like anti-violent. I really struggle even thinking about responding with violence to a situation. I'd like to think that when push came to shove, I could fight to try and protect myself or my family or my friends, but I've never been put in that position because I've always talked my way out of any potential issues. Or, you know, I don't even get very angry to things like, oh, you're driving the road, someone cuts you off. You know, like, I might have a flare of like fear and anger initially, but it never fuels. It's never something I feed. So it was an interesting character to follow, but also he's such a sympathetic character. I love Minori, his sister. She's such a good character and such a fun, like, diversion from a really dark timeline otherwise. I really enjoyed that. I also liked how his Mamiya is interesting because so each of these characters has that Mamiya spirit that follows them around and tries to whisper in their ear and pushes them. And his Mamiya, like a lot of the Mamiyas, it's not like that, like his Mamiya illusion was sitting there saying like, oh yeah, give in to your anger. You know, it's not like a little Darth Sidious saying like, use the dark side. He's more of like, he just asks some questions. It's like, what do you want? Like, how do you think this will work? I don't know. Like, I think you should do what you need to do, and you just need to figure out what you need to do. And it just guides him down a path where he doesn't turn to others for answers. He's convinced he has to make the decisions himself. And that leads him down the path of following his destructive instincts. And that's what's really cool about that, again, because all the Mamiyas are more about, they're not manipulative as they're telling their hosts to just be like, do this action, you want to do it. Instead, they kind of just push in the right area to guide them towards a conclusion. And that's what's so insidious about these illusions. And Rio's is probably the most like passive of all of them. And that's really fun to see because it makes a lot of sense in hindsight. The Rio story is really interesting because his peace and his solution being that he has to unleash the beast, that he has to accept who he is and he has to let it go. But then once he expresses that darkness and that violence in him, he's able to master it finally. He spends his whole life trying desperately to not lose control. And yet the solution was to let himself lose control once and just cut loose on somebody who really deserved it. And he was able to overcome that monster within. And like finally his path forward was finding a way to utilize his strengths in the pursuit of something good. That was really cool to see. Next would be Morichika. Morichika was the surprise one because he just comes off as a big delinquent at first. And his Mamiya is the little nurse girl. It's probably the most memorable form that Mamiya takes. And he has the interesting issue where he's considered really attractive and he often uses his body to kind of fulfill his needs. He will flirt with people, get taken home, and spend time with them, quote unquote. But his motivation isn't the actual physical connection and the sexual expression with the girl. That's kind of like how he pays for what he actually wants, which is a comfortable bed to sleep in and food to eat. He's homeless, but he's homeless and somehow is able to sleep around to make people happy. It's such an interesting existence. It's something that you don't think about ever being a real thing, but once you actually see it conceptualized, it's like, you know what, that probably does exist. People who just have a charisma, who don't have motivation to do much else, and so they just kind of bed hop, literally bed hop. And what that kind of existence is like, and the bitterness that he feels, where he's connecting with these people who are actively just using him for carnal pleasure. And he just accepts that because he doesn't know where his own value lies. In fact, he feels like he doesn't have value. And that's what the nurse kind of the nurse form Mamiya keeps telling him, just telling him to slow down, to take a break, that he doesn't have to push so hard. And that leads him to an icy death in the street, like a homeless death, just kind of all alone. But then you get into his later stories and later motivations, and you realize that his home had been broken. He blamed himself for that. Parents got separated. They'd already separated, but it got worse and worse. His brother abandoned him, even though his brother seemed to love him. One of the last things that his brother did before leaving was say hey, it's your fault that the family split apart, because he got sick. He was in the hospital all the time, and his parents had different ideas of how they should proceed, and that led them to being estranged. And his brother kind of tried to step up and take up that role, and eventually the bitterness that grew, the resentment that grew from his brother feeling like he had to do all this hard work to try and keep a family together that just wasn't going to stay together. And he turned it on his brother, and that was the beginning of that Mamiya illusion of feeling like he was unable or incapable of being a good person. And utilizing his talents as a flirter to basically charm his way through a basic life where he had no home, and any money he got, he gambled away. But in the end, his story comes around really powerfully, where he kind of has that self-actualization moment where he realizes that he doesn't need to be defined by the past, and instead he can kind of set his own path forward and embrace the hatred that his brother had for him. Because at first he always just was sad and ignored like the changes, but when he was able to realize that no, my brother Toma, he hates me no matter what I do, he was able to actually like embrace that choice and that truth and move forward with it. It was really beautiful. And then my favorite character of the entire game is Minato. Minato's story is probably my favorite in so many ways, because Minato's story is about not knowing who he is. And it explores it in the idea of either transgenderism / cross-dressing. It doesn't really take a hard line either way, and I think that that's intentional. It never was about an actualization of his of who Minato's identity really was. Even Minato admitted that it was not necessarily feeling like he should be somebody else or was born to be somebody else. It was that Minato didn't know who he was. He'd spent his whole life from childhood on basically molding to the expectations of those around him. The more the more he cared about somebody, the more he tried to reflect what they wanted. But it left this gaping hole of identity crisis where Minato didn't know who he was or what he wanted. And so he kind of just was doing whatever seemed best at the time. And that's something that can be really relatable to me. I feel like there's a lot to me that I feel like I'm just kind of there to play a role or to fill a obligation. The most likely place I can say that is something like at work. I go to work, I do my job, I'm trying to do my job well. I think I do decent. By the way, so this is one of the soundtracks that has like hidden messages in it. Like you can actually listen and hear like what the voice lines are saying. I'm not going to talk over it, but like if you hear weird stuff in the background, that's because there's an actual like poem / dialogue being read inside this musical track. So anyway, Minato's story reflects a lot in my regard because whilst obviously I'm not dealing with the same issues, my example from work is that I'm there, I'm doing my job, but my coworkers, they feel like that they know each other. They have stories that they share. They laugh. They talk about their lives. They goof around. And I've always, like, it's not just work. This is how it was for me at school. This is how it was for me even amongst my closest friends. I feel like I'm trying so hard just to have a baseline conversation with people where it feels like they just kind of vibe. And they have this almost... It's almost like they can all hear a beat that they're all playing like with, right? Like that they're all in tune with each other. And that I can't hear that beat. I have to just kind of play off of what I can hear. And I do just my best to be an accompaniment. Almost like... so this music has a good example of it, but it's like I'm the person who's playing the tambourine or the maracas or the cymbals, where like, yeah, I'm technically part of the music, right? But am I part of like the core of the music? If I stepped out, would the music really stop or feel like it was emptier? Maybe, but maybe not. There's a good argument to be made that sometimes those like additions to the musical scores aren't quite necessary. And that's how I feel about in my life when it comes to interacting with other people and trying to find a place where I fit. And Minato has that in spades, where Minato is almost like a doppelganger, where he takes the form that he feels is most needed rather than what he wants. And so even when he finally finds something that makes him feel fulfilled, that was his role as Mina, the maid, where he dressed up as a maid outfit and behaved like, looked like, and like acted like a girl. It wasn't so much this idea of like, oh, I should be a girl. It was, this is a way I can fulfill the desires of others, but also on my own terms. It was like the first time where Minato felt like he was able to dictate his own personality, I guess you could say. And that was by adopting a persona. But you found later on in the later chapters that despite having the Mamiya shadow that like follows him around, he's very depressed, and he feels like he feels like an outsider. And if he gives into his darker desires are basically to kind of embrace this non-personality, where he just grabs onto a specific person and says, who do you need me to be? And just becomes the perfect person for them. But by being malleable and being non-genuine. And it leads down a really dark path. Because because like I said, doppelganger is probably the best word for it. And that's why I said, like, it's not as clear cut as saying, like, oh, Minato's transgender or Minato's cross-dressing. Because I don't think it's that simple. I feel like it's just he gets pulled into this desire to be what he needs to be for the other person, and can't decide or commit on his own will and his own like wants in life. Because anytime he tries to make a decision about what he wants, he feels this super guilty. Because that's definitely what I most relate to, is that idea of that feeling guilty for wanting what you want and doing what you want, because you feel like it bothers other people, or it takes away from them, or it like relies on them. This channel is actually a guilty pleasure of mine, but I do feel guilty about it because I give it time. I put a lot of time into this channel. It might not seem like it, but for someone who's working full time and has like tons of other obligations, the time I dedicate to the channel definitely is a draw. And it's something that like my partner and my family have noted, that I will sometimes over prioritize like YouTube content over doing other stuff that's probably really important too, like family activities or like going out of town. I sometimes will be stressed about the idea of taking a vacation because like I'm gonna miss making videos, and like that's probably not healthy because it's something I want to do, but it shouldn't be all I want to do. And I've been a lot better about keeping that balance in the last like year. It used to be a lot worse, but now I know that, and I do take the time away, and I can step away and say like, hey, I'm just not gonna make this video this week, or hey, I'm gonna take a week off, or as you're gonna see in July, like I'm gonna be doing a significant thing, and that's gonna probably cause a delay in the content. I'm gonna try and avoid it, obviously, but like that's the idea, is that sometimes you feel selfish for wanting what you want. And Minato's journey is about understanding that like you can't define yourself by the wants of others, because it's just gonna leave you used and hollow, like a deflated bag at the end of it all. When you've been used and spent up and every last drop is squeezed away, it leaves you just feeling so hollow that the world doesn't have color anymore. And that's what leads Minato to making like such devastating personal decisions. So that's our core cast. That's like the main characters. There's other characters too that we get into a little bit. Because they're the members of the Pink House. They're the first people to see the Mamiya illusions of their own. Arasugawa, he's the writer, who feels unable to connect with other people despite being able to write stories that people enjoy. Like people connect with him, but he doesn't connect with others. Then you have Nagaki, who is very pretty, but that prettiness not only was something that her mother kind of used to try and live vicariously through her, but she also experienced a lot of sexual assault because of how pretty she was, and how when she tried to report it, she was basically brushed under the rug and told, don't cause problems, it's going to mess up what we have going, so just deal with it. And so she just kind of became used by others, and that led her to have this really warped perspective. And eventually she twists that around and starts using her beauty to control other people and to get them to do what she wants. You also get Samajima, who is basically a psychopath who works with police because it lets him get close to blood and death because he's obsessed with it. And he's trying to control his urges and do something right. But his Mamiya gives him an outlet where he gets to have an illusion of a child that he gets to kill, which in his opinion is like his ultimate deep, like dark pleasure. So it lets him sate that desire, which is super disturbing. And then you have Toma, who is the older brother of oh gosh, darn it, I know his name. Gosh darn it, it's the guy who sleeps around. Anyway, sorry. I keep wanting to say Hibiki because I think this is also is a name, but I'm not sure. Toma Morichika, that's it, Morichika. He's a brother from Morichika, but Toma is like he's like good looking, he has a very successful career, and yet he feels like a lot of the promise and the happiness of his life was stolen from him by others. And he just needed a friend who would like listen to him and the ugly thoughts that he had, that he kept hidden away because he recognized that like nobody would agree that he wasn't at fault, or that it was his brother was like a terrible person for tearing their family apart. Like he knew that like everyone would see that as unreasonable, and so he just needed somebody who would like allow him to just vent and just say like, look, I'm great, because like that was the thing. It's like, I'm a great person, I don't know why I have to suffer for this. And those four, so they see the Mamiya illusion, and that's what's so crazy about that story, the idea that they see the illusion. It became a meaningful way that they were able to deal with life, because a Mamiya, after saving Suo, and since he couldn't leave his normal his like ghost existence, he tries to find people whom he can help. So he becomes an illusion to them, appearing to them and saying, hey, I'll be what you need so you can have a normal functioning life. And he lets the four people in the pink house kind of move on. But then eventually when he steps forward and saves Suo, like where he like saves his life and then he dies, he no longer can manifest to them. And so then the illusion suddenly just vanishes, for all four of them at the same time. And desperate to try and get the illusion back, they decide to self-delude themselves. And they have a funeral for Mamiya, who isn't a real person. And then they go out into the woods and they have a ritual where they consume the flesh of Mamiya, where they basically accept madness. They say, like, they decide, you know what, we'd rather be absolutely crazy than lose the Mamiya. And so then they decide, hey, we're not crazy. What if we make sure other people see things that aren't there, like have these like illusions with them, and we make sure that they call them Mamiya, make sure Mamiya continues to exist. And that's the whole premise of the story. And what you've learned is that this whole idea is that there's these shades embedded in people's minds, influencing them, meant to be perpetuating themselves. Because for the original four, it wasn't just that Mamiya helped them. It was the fact that they needed Mamiya to just exist. And so they put children that they find through trauma and manipulate them, and then giving them a psychological like idea of saying, hey, you can use Mamiya, and Mamiya is your best friend, and they will walk by you and help you find your answers that you need. And by planting that seed, it makes that like reality. That's what's insane about it all. So let's talk about the Mamiya itself. So Mamiya is that entity. We've kind of talked about his past. He was an imaginary friend for Suo, who started to become an imaginary friend for other people because he just wanted to help. He didn't like watching people suffer and watching them walk down a path of self-destruction. So the four people in the pink house, Arasugawa, Samajima, Toma, and Nigaki. So he reaches out to all of them and becomes their imaginary friends as well. But then when Suo is about to die, he's someone who Mamiya cares about. He breaks taboo. He manifests physically for like a minute just to save Suo, and then like essentially dies, being unable to manifest anymore, living as a half ghost, like a partial ghost. If you've read like Harry Potter, he basically becomes what Voldemort becomes, where he's like a fragment of a fragment of a fragment of a soul. And so he can't technically die, but he also doesn't really exist anymore when in that state. That's what Mamiya basically is. And so you then see him fractured off into these different like pseudo-Mamiyas that were implanted, these delusions that were passed on from the first generation to the new generation, which is the focus of the game. And those delusions all call themselves Mamiya, but they're not actually tied to the original entity. They're literally a concept that is invented by the people who saw the original. And it's all like an experiment for them to try and force a manifestation of Mamiya to return. And Mamiya's ultimate desire, like a madness that accompanies him after like watching like all these people that he cares about break, he becomes obsessed with this idea of trying to find a way to get himself his own body, to embrace one of these people and somehow try and manipulate or possess them and become his own entity. And that's terrifying too, because that's really, he gets really close to pulling it off. So he comes across as the villain for the first 2 acts. Like, first act, you don't know anything about him. Second act, you start to unravel the mystery, and eventually you meet the like Mamiya, like what's left of him. And he manipulates the main character, Natsumi, into fusing the timelines because it strengthens Mamiya and gives him the ability to start manifesting himself again. Because the more people who believe in him, it gives him like substance because he's an idea. And ideas are conceptually based, like they're conceptually tied to the people of the world. And so it's really interesting. Again, like I talked about, the whole like rules of this stuff doesn't make a ton of sense. Like, it's consistent, but it also is never explained. So you're kind of left a lot of interpretation. And I believe that I already saw whispers of how active the online community is for the game. That they are like that there's an active conversation about like the way things are and how they should be interpreted. That's really interesting. But finally, we'll get to like the main character, which is funny. Like, why would you talk about the main character last? Well, that's because all the setup really matters for him is Natsumi. So Natsumi is a person who died, but Natsumi's story, it turns out, doesn't start there. Like you know how insane it is and how cool it is to know that Natsumi was a parallel entity like Mamiya, but one that got born into a body. That's so mad, like so mad. It's so crazy. That was such a cool reveal. Natsumi as a character is really fun because he's the closest to a self-insert, but they do a good job of making sure that he has his own personality. Like, you feel like you can relate to him as a reader, and yet he also feels like a distinctive character, where a lot of main characters or point of view characters, even if they're not intended to be a self-insert, still feel very plain, because you want to, like, there's a fear, I think, when you're writing a story like a visual novel, that you want to make sure that the reader can feel like they can relate to the main character, because otherwise they're going to be disconnected and probably lose interest. But that can lead to hollow characters that feel like empty shells, like Link in the Zelda games, like Ocarina of Time. You have all these characters that have interactions and narrators, or heck, even I'd say Breath of the Wild does this too, where you have like complex characters and friends and people around, and like there's these big events happening, and they're always like, oh, we gotta fight Ganon, we gotta do all these things, right? But Link himself, he doesn't say anything. He doesn't participate in these conversations. They just kind of happen around him, and then he just does what people tell him. That's like, he's a husk character. And that works because it means that everybody feels like they can relate to him in some way, but at the same time, it means that there's no substance. Everyone just is able to interpret what they want. And like, even then, I feel like there's still a level of disconnect, where I think Natsumi is a better example of how that can be done, where Natsumi had a distinctive personality, but he also had a means of communicating in the story with the reader that made it so that it was hard not to want to relate with him and understand his thoughts and where he came from. So Natsumi dies, and he goes to the Trichiliocosm, which is basically, think elevated purgatory. It manifests as a library full of books from various parallel worlds, and he gets ascended to a spectator, which is like an angel, but the angels are more. But this angel's job is about like developing the consistency of a timeline, where they basically they read a book, which is basically the branching potential timelines of a certain era, and they just decide which one's the canon one, and they basically write that story. It's almost like, imagine you got a AI to write a book, you give it a premise, or even multiple AI programs, you give them the same prompt. Like, tell me a story about people riding dragons in war. And they spit out about 12 different stories. They use the same premise and maybe even like the same character names, but then they just wrote them all out. A spectator looks at reality's branching timelines, which is basically those multiple, like, same prompts, same characters, but completely different outcomes. And they decide which one keeps the consistency of the sacred timeline. And they like report to a lord, but they basically say is God, but they don't outright say. Oh gosh, there's some high concept stuff they work with there. But that's the whole idea, is that most of the time a spectator comes in, they were a person who was alive because they're a soul, but their memory's wiped so they can be objective. But Natsumi remembers where he came from and remembers the friends that he knew, and he goes into that same story and he's trying to save everybody. And it's such a cool way where he's like manipulating the story, and he inserts himself into their lives where they can see him and interact with him, but he doesn't look like the same person that they knew him as in life. But he's able to try and influence them. He tries to save them. He tries to first save them from the circumstances, and then realizes that there's a spirit of Mamiya influencing them. So then he tries to save them from Mamiya by saying, hey, you don't need to rely on like what that thing is saying. You can just be yourself. But he inadvertently replaces Mamiya with himself, because instead of grasping to the delusion of the Mamiya, that Mamiya gets shattered. But then when Natsumi vanishes, because he can't stay around forever, then they were like reliant on him. So then they start inventing their own illusions of him and starting to try and bring him back, basically repeating the same exact process that the original Mamiya did. And that was my favorite part of the ending of chapter 2, which is that realization of like, oh no, by trying to stop the influence of Mamiya, I just replaced Mamiya with my own influence. And that realization of like, I just literally did the exact same thing that Mamiya did, because the motivation was the same. Like, they just wanted to save people. And that was so cool. That was such a cool delivery and such a good reveal. Absolutely phenomenal. Phenomenal writing when it came to that. That was amazing. So yeah, that's the whole cast. And then so just how do I feel about the story? Again, I pretty much had to just verbally state the story, which is weird because normally I don't have to recite the story, but like I feel like you need the context in order to understand like why I like the characters. Natsumi specifically, I love the definition of him. Like, you can almost think of the chapter part, like the acts, like is all based around Natsumi. Act 1 is Natsumi like reaching into a different world and seeing how like invisible entities are influencing the people he cares about, and like trying to figure out what that entity is. Act 2 is he learned about Mamiya, and Act 2 is about him trying to save everyone from Mamiya, but inadvertently just replacing Mamiya with himself. And then Act 3 is in a desperate desire to fix everything. He fuses the timelines together so that the year 1999 and the year 2012 are happening at the same time, because they're both years that the world was prophesied to end. That's like the connection. The fact that they're connected in a conceptual way like that, and then have the timelines smashed together, is such a crazy concept to work with. It's such an interesting way to tell a story. And it's like a time travel story that's not time travel. It's so cool. It's such an interesting way to do it, and so unique. I've just never seen a story approached like this. Like I've seen stories that use similar beats, but usually in isolation. To have all these things be put together in such a way is so interesting. So yeah, all in all, fantastic. The ending was phenomenal. The idea that Natsumi kind of closed the loop, because he realized that the ultimate thing he needed to do was to trust Mamiya, because he recognized what Mamiya was and why he did what he did, and realized that Mamiya wasn't the villain that he seemed. And so he trusted Mamiya to take up the mantle and to just do what he always wanted to do, but wiser and smarter and better understanding of what's going on. And in so doing, sacrificing himself, where he basically took upon himself and obliterated himself. Now, it implied that there might be some type of future path for Natsumi, but in the epilogue, but it's such a vague hint that's really just up to interpretation. I don't really know how I feel. I think that there's a lot more closure in the idea that Natsumi basically deleted himself from existence because he wanted to make the sacrifice. Like, what's it say? Like that famous quote from the Bible is like, greater love hath no man than this, than he laid down his life for his friends. That was Natsumi. Like, he destroyed everything he was, everything he will be, and everything he could have been, because he knew that if he did so, he could bridge that gap, stop Mamiya from being the negative influence he became on accident, and that stopped the negative influence that Natsumi also himself became out by accident. And by doing so, he gave Mamiya the power to be able to tweak the story like he always did, but in a way that was more permanent and more like intelligent, more well done. It just implied such a cool ending where, like, through sacrifice, a path was made that could never have been made before. Yeah, I think there's a lot of analogies you can make with like the Christian like religious concepts, but it's not overt. Like, you can see Natsumi as a savior-like character. The idea of sacrificing themselves in order to to pave the way forward for everyone else. To be someone who was relatively innocent, but who was willing to give up everything to save those who were guilty, who had been making mistakes, but because he saw the good in them. And there's a lot of religious connotation, even like there's a lot of stuff in the Christian church. A lot of the concepts and the verbiage is very Christian oriented or referential, but it's not overt and it's not preachy. It's really neat to see that, because it can be so either if you use religion as a framework to try and tell a story, usually it comes off like, I would almost say like stolen valor. That's not a great word for it, but this idea of like, you're just using catchy names to kind of fulfill gaps in your story where it feels very cliche. And then on the other side of it, you can also try and avoid like using religious connotations, maybe just using like names of stuff, but like you don't actually like use it as an inspiration. So it just feels hollow because you're just using the words. I think this story uses a lot of Christian-based, like, I would call lore, theocracy, but without it being about being Christian. It's about the concepts of Christianity, about the story of Christ and what it meant, and the powers that be, rather than trying to just kind of copy, change some details, and pasting Christian like narratives, values, characters. It really, I feel like, was like somebody who wrote this was somebody who probably grew up with religion, who truly understood like what the point of religion was without getting bogged down by the actual religion. If that makes any sense. And so it's like, it's a really interesting way to express that, but it's like, I can see this story and I kind of categorize it in my head very similarly to how I categorize like the Chronicles of Narnia, where the Chronicles of Narnia are heavily, heavily implicated and designed to be allegories for the Christian faith and Christian like worldview, but in a way that doesn't feel like, I mean, it feels pretty obvious because it's not written to be it's meant to be a story for young adults and children, like teens and young adults. But you can it's not beating you over the head with the symbolism. It just lets you see it if you know where to look for it. I feel like Mamiya is like a more mature version of something like that, where it plays with concepts that are clearly inspired by the Christian theology, but it doesn't hang itself on that, nor is it trying to shove anything down your throat. It's simply using some of the concepts and the core beliefs as the core to the stories that are told here. And I love how, despite the fact that absolutely something like metaphysical, magical is happening, that none of the major plays, none of the major shifts, none of the major events revolve around like the supernatural. That when the resolutions are found for the characters, it's about them confronting the real life problems with their actual selves. That they ignore the interference of other beings and just keep it contained in human interaction. As rough and violent as and messy as it got, I liked the message that by removing the metaphysical shortcut answers that were attempting to be there, by circumventing them, they found the actual solutions by just confronting each other human to human. And that's, I think, the ultimate message of the story, is that humans are flawed, but when we work hard to try and overcome our flaws and are willing to talk with each other and to compromise, that we actually can find progress and make that progress. And that's ultimately the story of Mamiya. So, kind of coming to an end here, what do I want to say about this? It's a beautiful experience. I'm really happy I was able to have it in my life, and it's one that's not going to leave my head anytime soon. It's one of those stories that I'm going to struggle to recommend to people, because I genuinely don't know how other people would receive this story. I think it's worth a try. If anything, if I could talk to anybody, like I did at the beginning of this video, where I'm trying to say, like, here I would want to, I want people to read this story. How would I persuade them to do it, or when would I offer it to them? And I don't know. I think it's something that everyone should give a chance, but I would not be surprised if a lot of people dropped it, because the payoff is a slow burn, and the topics are very uncomfortable, because it really tries to analyze some of the darkest aspects of humanity. But it's beautiful because of that. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. I'm pretty happy with the way things were played out. And I'm really glad that I was able to share this. It's been a long time coming, because parts 1 and 2 were done, and part 3 took a while to come out. And because of the way I was scheduling my channel, and the slow lumbering nature of visual novel content, it took a long time for us to finish this. But I'm really, really happy we did. It was kind of something that was always in the back of my mind. It was like, oh, I really need to figure out how that story ends. So I'm really happy to be here and having finished it. If I had to pick a favorite character, I already said Minato definitely is my favorite character. Natsumi's great, but I feel like it's almost too plain Jane. Minato was definitely the character that I felt got me thinking the most. Gave me reflection. Right, I recognized parts of myself I hadn't really acknowledged in Minato's story. And I also feel like I was always happy with the type of stories that were shared with Minato. But the story itself, the game itself, is just such a fantastic experience. I'm really happy it was something I was able to make a part of my life. So, highly recommend. I think this is something that people need to read more of. It's not going to be for everybody, but I think everyone should at least try it. And I can't wait to hear some of the conversations that get spawned from a game like this. Janoris Lenore, like you're tuning in, and just tuning in, rewinding to the beginning and listening while editing my YouTube shorts and TikToks for tonight and tomorrow. Hey, fellow creator, hope you have a good success. I'm glad you're here. Yeah, absolutely. Carrying my thoughts. It's definitely going to be a different one, because I'm basically talking about my impression of the characters, which means I have to explain them a bit and like why, what happened. So hopefully that makes sense. But it feels like instead of giving it as much of a review, it was mostly a summary. Because it feels like without some context, what I wanted to say about the characters didn't make any sense. But it's been such a fun story. I've been really, really excited with it. Like I said before, too, like my least favorite character was Suo, but because he made me uncomfortable as a character. But he's such an important part, and it's not a bad thing. Like, it's like when you get a box of macaroons. You can have a least favorite macaroon, but still a macaroon. So it's like, you're still talking pretty top tier as far as like what you're discussing, but you're allowed to have like a range in there. I feel like I feel like this is one of those things that you experience and you can't ever like re-experience, and you're not likely to ever find something quite the same. So it's one of the most unique pieces of media. And so I'm really happy it was a part of my life. And whilst I move on, I hope that if these creators, these writers, these artists, these musicians come together again and do something else, I want to find that project. I want to see what else that they got up their sleeve. I do think, like I said at the beginning, Mamiya is one of those videos that, like, while the concepts are super out there, this could be one that could be adapted to a different medium and I think would work. I could see this being a very interesting, like, anime. I could see it being a movie. I feel like a movie though would be too limiting. Anime is probably the best medium I could expect, but the art style would also be really tough to copy into an animated form, just because it's so visceral. Maybe the team who did things like the Castlevania animation, like that was pretty good because it was very grungy. Gizia, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's been a great time following your journey. I appreciate you being here. Hopefully there's more stuff on the channel that, like, anybody who's here who like followed my journey with Mamiya, it's a unique experience. I hope that there's more good things on my channel that you can explore with me. But I also understand that, like, the Mamiya fan base is almost very singular. I get the impression that a lot of the people who fell in love with this story aren't necessarily like strict visual novel fans. That it kind of captures its own feel and kind of stands apart from what most other visual novels try to do and try to be. I still feel like there's a lot of value for people who enjoy this story and other things like visual novels or other JRPGs and things that we've been covering on the channel. But it's definitely more unique, and it's not something that you're going to be able to find a lot of in the world. And that's probably for the best. But yeah, this has definitely been a journey. Thank you so much. Just know that this has been one of my favorite experiences, and I will probably not shut up about it. You'll hear me talking about it in the future. Before you go, if you're interested, I do have an announcement at the end of this. I'm going to kind of do a spoiler for the next game. It's not really a spoiler. I'm just going to play the trailer for the game. I'm probably just going to pull up the Steam page real fast, or I captured a copy of it. Actually, yeah, I got a copy of it, so I'll pull it up from a Steam page to kind of announce the next game I'm going to be playing on the Wednesday slot. It won't start this week. I didn't have, again, I'm working full time. I got other obligations. I focused on preparing for tonight's live stream rather than trying to also record a new video for the Wednesday slot, because I used to do these wrap parties on the same night of the normal broadcast, but I'll be working, so can't really do that. So I will start this next series next week, but I think it'll be fun because just like Mamiya, Wednesday's kind of becoming my catch-up day, where I'm finally gonna reaching out and grabbing series that I've been wanting to get to for a while because we've covered others in their chain and just haven't completed them yet. So we're gonna continue that because I really want to. So we're gonna be saying hello to a series that hasn't been featured on the channel in years, and it's about time we get to this point. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate everyone who was here in chat. It was really nice to talk to each and every one of you who are here live. If you weren't here live, you can always leave a comment in the archive video. I can try and respond to them. Unfortunately, when it comes to videos that have been posted for a while or live streams, those comments don't always get recommended or pushed to me for me to see, like, if you said anything on them. And after a few weeks, it's hard. It's not like I go back and scour through the comment sections to see if I missed something, just because I put out a lot of content. So I'd love to read your comments on this video. If you're watching this later, I might not respond to you because, like, sometimes I'm kind of left to the whims of YouTube and the way that they work their apps for me to see when people leave comments. But I'll try. But still, I'd love to know your thoughts about this series as a whole. Maybe some of your favorite parts, maybe your favorite character, and some of the things that were meaningful for you. I shared all my stuff. I'd love to hear yours. But anyway, thank you all so much for being here. I hope you enjoy this sneak peek into what's coming up next on the channel, and that ultimately you look forward to seeing future content with me. But until the next video you're watching me or happen to see me in next, I'll see you there. Have a good evening, everyone, and I'll see you soon.
唾を吐き痛みに切り裂かれながら燃やす復活の炎にじられた記憶鮮やかに色を